It happens to all of us all the time. Negative stereotypes about our identities hover in the air around us. When we are in situations to which these stereotypes are relevant, we understand that we could be judged or treated in terms of them. We present ourselves in counter-stereotypical ways. We avoid situations where we have to contend with this pressure. It often organizes our actions and choices, our lives. We think of ourselves as autonomous individuals. After all, we make choices. But we often forget that we make choices within context, always. Hi everyone, I am Kiera Somerville. I'm curious, how did that quote make you all feel? Before we start our discussion today, we're going to take some time to reflect on who we are. I want you all to think about the following questions as we move through the discussion today. Who are you? Which of your identities is most salient to you? What do you believe others to think about you? And broadly, what do you believe others to think about your most salient identity? So here lies our topic of discussion today, stereotype threat. When you think of the words stereotype and threat, what do you think? Here's what the research says. Claude Steele is the pioneer of research of stereotype threat. He says, the idea of stereotype threat is this very simple idea that if you're trying to perform in an area where your group is negatively stereotyped, you're going to feel an extra pressure, a distracting kind of pressure. And that pressure can affect how well you perform. If you don't know how to deal with it, it can have this kind of effect. That is the source of this underperformance. So, Claude Steele, here he is. In order to understand stereotype threat, it's important that you know some of his background. Steele is a social psychologist. His research is situated on the context of the individual and how an individual experiences threats to self and the consequences of those threats. The opening quote for this presentation was from Steele's first book, published in 2010, Whistling Vivaldi, How Stereotypes Affect Us and What We Can Do. The book talks about Steele's coming to know his Black identity and how that experience shaped his worldview and research interest. The book helps readers understand stereotype threat and its effect on certain social groups, like the ones listed on the cover of the text. The book's namesake comes from a story about Brent Staples. He's currently an editor for the New York Times, but at one point he was a graduate student at the University of Chicago. Well, as a student of Chicago, he dressed in informal student clothing and he would walk the streets of Chicago's Hyde Park neighborhood. In Staples' own words, he became an expert in the language of fear. He noticed that when he walked, others would stereotype him as violence-prone, like the young African-American males in the neighborhood. People would lock arms with their partner, cross the street, avoid eye contact with him. This behavior from others and their perceptions in turn made him nervous and avoid the area by walking down side streets. Out of nervousness, he began to whistle and he liked what he heard. Instead of continuing to avoid the area, he walked and whistled the Beatles and Antonio Vivaldi's Four Seasons. So what did this do? This caused him to be seen differently in the eyes of people on the Chicago streets. He began to be seen as educated and in tune with high white culture. The story of the namesake of Steele's book is important for understanding stereotype threat, but only up to the point where Staples described feeling nervous. This feeling of pressure from negative stereotypes of his Black male identity had an effect on how he performed. He started to avoid putting others in danger by avoiding walking in the same path of those who stereotyped him. So you may be thinking, how in the world did Steele and his research team come up with this notion of stereotype threat? Again, stereotype threat is when people feel at risk of conforming to stereotypes about their social group. Based on this pressure or anxiety, it reduces the performance of the individual who belongs to the negatively stereotyped group. It's important to note that the individual doesn't have to subscribe to the stereotype for it to be activated. Just mere knowledge of the stereotype can affect an individual's performance. The individual may feel as if they will be judged or treated or reduced based on that stereotype. Again, even if they don't believe the stereotype themselves. Here are 3 more examples. You may remember this example from Kim Bain's book on what the best college teachers do. Bain referenced Steele's work and mentioned there are stereotypes that surround African American and Hispanic students in academic performance, as well as women in math and physics. Steele noticed that even well-prepared, ambitious, self-confident, middle and upper-class African American students academically lagged behind similar groups of white American students. He also knew that educated men have concluded that women do poorly in math and physics because of their gender. Why, though? Steele would argue it's stereotype threat. Even though middle and upper class African American students may have had the same schooling and test scores as their white counterparts, the pressure and anxiety that comes with knowing that black people are stereotypically not as smart as white people can have an effect on their academic performance. It's a similar situation with women. Though women in math and physics may have the same level of preparation as men in math and physics, they may underperform due to the mere knowledge of the stereotype that women are not smarter than men, particularly in STEM fields. Stereotype threat is a contributing factor to racial and gender gaps. It's important to note any identity can experience stereotype threat, even white men. All groups of people experience negative stereotypes. A study on white athletes and black athletes revealed that when white athletes were told they would be tested based on athletic aptitude, they performed worse than the black athletes. This could be because the white athletes knew that they were negatively stereotyped as lesser skilled as black athletes. So, to sum up stereotype threat, it is a theory that when facing a negative stereotype about their social group, the anxiety from knowing the negative stereotype prevents the individual from doing their best. So, how can we as educators foster a space that prevents stereotype threat? Here are some recommendations from Steele. The first is to change the way we give critical feedback. By doing this, we can dramatically improve minority students' motivation and receptiveness. The second is to allow students a sense of identity safety, valuing diversity that people bring into the classroom. The third is to foster intergroup conversations among students from different backgrounds. This can improve minority students' comfort and their grades. The last recommendation is to allow students, especially minority students, to affirm their most valued sense of self. This concludes the presentation. Here's a list of references for you, and more are listed on the blog post. What questions do you all still have? Leave them on the blog. I hope you enjoyed this presentation.